Hello and welcome. On today's show, we'll be speaking with Dr. Lotte Valentine. She is a naturopath medical doctor, an author, an evidential psychic medium, a medical medium, an ancestral healer, a spiritual teacher, an international keynote speaker. She also is the host of her own podcast called Dr. Lotte Science with Soul. She's had not one, but two near-death experiences, which would set her on a path of awakening, ignite her spiritual gifts, and lead her to attend med school at the age of 54. I'm so excited to have her here today. So welcome, Dr. Lotte.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I'm so excited to hear your story. It's an incredible one. So I'm pretty much just going to turn it over to you. I'll have you pick up wherever you feel is relevant, and we'll just go from there.
All right, let's start from the beginning. So I had two near-death experiences, and the first one happened after my third child was born. So I had two boys already that were 6 years old and 3.5 years old. And the birth of my daughter itself was traumatic because she was born between a 7.4 and a 7.2 earthquake. So we headed to the hospital, which was in Eastern Anaheim in California. So people who have been to Disneyland knows where Anaheim is. But this hospital was centered in the eastern part, so right before the desert. And the earthquake was centered in the desert. So we were kind of the first town that was the closest to that epicenter. So I'm on the labor table, I'm contracting like 3 minutes apart, and this 7.4 earthquake hits. And it's one of the moments in my life when I thought I was going to die. And there were the windows, like from the floor to the ceiling. And I'm lying on this table, everybody's leaning over onto the table to try to hold me still so I won't levitate off the table. And you know how they have in the hospitals, they have those metal trays with all the metal instruments, and they were just levitating like up and down. It was like a movie, like a bad movie, like a disaster movie. And as I'm lying on this table, so I'm lying on the table, I can see all the ceiling tiles. And the only thing I could think of was we are going to be buried in this rubble because all the ceiling tiles are going to fall in. We lost the power. Everything just went quiet, and the rumbling. And this hospital was built on rollers. So the whole hospital was rolling back and forth. And I figured, well, the windows are going to cave in. The ceiling tiles are going to cave in. And I never thought I was going to die this way. That was the thought that went through my mind. And it was so bad, my labor actually stopped. So when you're running from the tiger in the jungle, you don't have time to give birth. So it's going to stop temporarily while you get yourself to safety. So after about half an hour, my labor kicked back up and my daughter was born. And then shortly after her birth, and they gave me the baby to hold, I was in excruciating pain, and I just bent over backwards and just yelled for my husband. I was like, take the baby, take the baby. And I had all these blood clots come out, and they were massaging my uterus, trying to contract it. Would they have done something different? Could they have done like a DNC or something like that? Probably, but we were in the middle of an earthquake, right? We didn't even have power in the hospital. We were running on generators at this point, and one aftershock after another. So they put me on this IV drip to contract the uterus to help squeeze the blood clots out. And also while I was giving birth, I told the midwife, I said, check that placenta, because it felt like somebody was ripping off a piece of duct tape on the inside of my uterus. And I had already had 2 births, so I knew that there was something that wasn't normal about this birth. And I remember the midwife holding up the placenta and flipping it back and forth. And she said, well, it looks whole. I can't see anything missing. So they kept me in the hospital an extra day. And then they said, okay, well, things seem good now. It's a normal amount of bleeding after birth. And they sent me on my way. Well, 10 days after birth, I had a lot of pain inside my uterus. So imagine like swallowing a bowling ball. This is my best description. And that bowling ball is sitting at the bottom of your pelvis, and it's very heavy. And so it aches, and it's a lot of pain, and it goes down your legs. And that's what I was experiencing. I couldn't figure out why I was having so much pain, because I hadn't had pain with my other births like that. And then I started hemorrhaging, and I had this very large blood clot, the size of a man's large fist. So a lot of blood came out, and we went to the ER, and they examined me, and they said, well, not much blood is coming out right now. It could have been a second lining that came out. And they sent me on my way. No blood work, no ultrasound, nothing. Then the next evening, the same thing. I hemorrhaged again, same amount of blood. We called the hospital because it was 9:30 at night. The boys were already asleep. The baby was asleep. My parents were there from Sweden, because I was born and raised in Europe, in Sweden. And they were helping with the kids. And we said, and I yelled to my husband as he's on the phone with the hospital, I'm not going. They're not going to do anything, because now I'm not bleeding anymore. And it was decided that I should see the doctor in Huntington Beach, California, where we lived at the time. So Friday morning comes around, we go to the doctor, same thing again, manual inspection. Well, not much blood, it seems to be coming out right now. It could have been another lining coming out. And I'm thinking, how many linings can you shed, right? No blood work, no ultrasound, nothing. And he sent me on my way. And then again that afternoon, hemorrhage again. So we go back to the ER. They come in, they do another manual inspection, and they say, well, not much bleeding is going on right now. So they leave me in this room and close the door. And I didn't have, this is in 1992. I had no bell to ring. I'm just lying on this table. And eventually I start bleeding. And the only thing I can think of is, wow, this is good, because I'm finally bleeding in the ER. They're finally going to figure out something is wrong. And all of a sudden, this nurse comes in to check on me. I think the spirit world literally sent her, because everything is just perfect timing for me to survive this ordeal. So she comes in, she opens the door, and her jaw just drops. She's just like, oh, like horrified at what she's seeing, because there's so much blood on the table, and like all these papers, you know how they have paper on the tables in the hospitals. So she quickly cleans that up, and I can hear the call on the loudspeaker, OBGYN, stat to the ER, OBGYN, stat to the ER. So I'm just thinking, great, they finally realize something is really wrong. And this middle-aged doctor comes running in, and he has a younger physician in tow. And again, they do a manual inspection. And as they're doing this manual inspection, another large blood clot comes out. So at this point, the doctor, when he came in, his first question was, how much have you been bleeding? And I said, this is my third day of hemorrhaging. So he already understood that I had lost a lot of blood, thank God. So he was, he had probably seen this before. He was middle-aged. And all I could think was, I'm so glad they sent this doctor that's older, because he'll know what's wrong, because he will have seen thousands of patients in his work, and he will have seen this problem before. So they do this manual inspection, and another large blood clot comes up, and I try to sit up and tell him that I'm not feeling too good. And right away, he already understands what's going on. So he just pushes me back onto the table, and they start raising the tables or lowering the table. So my head goes towards the floor, my feet goes towards the ceiling. And at this point, my eyes are closed, because I can't keep them open anymore. And I can hear the room fill with all the medical personnel. I can feel the nurse on my left trying to place an IV. Today they place IVs as a precaution, so they have access to your veins, because once you start going into shock, they can't access the veins anymore because they collapse. So I'm thinking, what's taking her so long? Why can't she get that IV in? Because I didn't have any medical training back then, right? So I didn't understand. And then the nurse on my right is quoting my blood pressure. And at this point, I just feel like I'm falling. So imagine jumping out of an airplane and just free fall towards the earth. And I think part of that experience is just part of the blood pressure dropping. It's just this feeling of crashing. And the nurse on my right yells out 50/15, hurry. And that was my blood pressure. So at this point, they know, you're going below a blood pressure supporting the heart rate. So they know we're talking seconds now to save this person. And I'm thinking, what's taking them so long? And then shortly after she yells out the 50/15, I know that I'm dying. And this experience was very different from that experience in the earthquake when I thought I was going to die. People who have been in car accidents or almost in a car accident, you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is it, I'm going to die. But this was a knowing. I was completely aware of the fact that I was dying at this point. So I'm lying on this table. I'm a complete atheist. I don't believe in the afterlife. I don't believe in angels. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in anything. I have a completely materialistic worldview. And at this point, what do? I pray to God to save my life. So I say, I have 3 children under the age of 6. Please let me live. They need a mother. And it was shortly after that I was just pulled out of my body. And it happens so quickly because 1 second you're inside your body, or a millisecond or a billionth second, and the next second you're outside. And it happens so fast, that transition, that it's sort of incomprehensible to the brain to understand that transition because it's so fast. It's just instantaneous. But then I find myself floating above my body, maybe 3 or 5 feet above my body. But as I'm outside my body, my first thought is, how can I be outside my body and still be me? This is not supposed to happen. I had no belief system that this was even possible. For me, it was, you die, it's black, you're gone, and that's it. There is nothing else. So here I am outside my body, but also there is this knowledge that there is no time on the other side. So you have access to past, present, and future all at the same time. There is no time. But there's also just this unconditional love and peace of being in that state. There is no fear of anything. And as I'm hovering in this state, all of a sudden I get sucked back in. And my best description of that getting sucked back in is, for people who have seen the movie Santa Claus with Tim Allen, when he delivers presents and he goes through the chimney and he just sort of gets sucked back down through the chimney. That's the feeling. It was like a giant vacuum cleaner or something. It was the suction to the feeling of going back in the body. So it gets sucked back into my body, which was different because you leave the body and it's just a split second you're inside and a split second you're outside, but there was this suction energy to getting sucked back in, which is interesting. And then that next morning, I was still in the hospital, and that next morning I could hear my sister-in-law in the left corner of the ceiling, and I could hear her say, everything's going to be okay. And she had just passed away 10 days earlier. And so all of a sudden I could hear the spirit world, and I had been outside my body. So I'm lying in this hospital bed, with a pounding headache and cold hands and feet because I'd lost so much blood. And I'm thinking, I don't know what to make out of what the experience I had the day before. But I think the nurse that came to check on me was aware of these experiences. I had never heard of a near-death experience. I didn't know what had happened. And she said, did anything unusual happen yesterday? Did you have any unusual experience? And I said, no, nothing at all. Because I was petrified that if I shared what had happened, they would lock me up and think, she has some mental issue and we got to keep her here in the hospital and I'll never see my kids again. So I was afraid of even sharing my story at that time. So then I get sent home, and then I get really sick. So it took me a good 6 months before I even left the house. And I know my parents changed their tickets back to Sweden twice, and then they left, and then my mother-in-law came. We had constant help for 2 or 3 months because I barely have any memories. I just slept a lot because I'd lost so much blood. And then pretty much sat in a rocking chair until Christmas, and just slowly started to build back my body. And I had been super healthy, going into this. I was 34 years old. I had just gotten a degree in nutrition, was just in perfect health. And then we all got really sick that Christmas. And now the baby is 6 months old. And we didn't have any insurance at the time because my husband's company had gotten bought. Everybody got laid off. We were in our early 30s, and we can't afford Cobra for a family of 5, right? So 3 kids and 2 adults. So I said, no, we're just going to wait. Just wait, take this job and everything will work out. We all get the flu. everybody gets antibiotics and everybody gets better. 8 days later, I'm getting sicker. So I go back into this walk-in clinic, because we just went to a walk-in clinic because we didn't have a regular physician. And they said, weren't you just here? And I said, yes, but now everything is worse. And they're saying, yeah, you're way worse. So they take a blood sample and they come back in the room and they said, do you have AIDS or leukemia? And I said, well, I hope neither. This is what happened to me. And I hadn't gotten a blood transfusion because I spoke to the doctor. As soon as they revived me, the doctor said, we need to give you blood. And I said, wait, do you have to give me blood? Because everybody back then was getting AIDS that were getting, or not everybody, but a lot of people were getting AIDS because we didn't have a way of checking the blood back then. And so he said, we'll see what we can do. And then they gave me all these supplements and medications. And so it took longer for me to build all that blood back up, but I also didn't have a blood transfusion. So I said, well, I probably don't have AIDS because I didn't get the blood transfusion. And they said, well, you're really sick. You have to go to the ER because you have no immune system. And I said, well, I don't have insurance. So if I go to the ER, I'm never going to get insurance. And my husband we're almost to the point where we're going to get insurance. So they gave me, more medication, sent me on my way. And somehow I managed to get out of that pickle and I started to get better. And then I started bruising. So I would get these big bruises. So I bumped into the baby's changing table. Something that would give you a bruise the size of a nickel gave me a massive bruise that spanned my entire hip that was purple and red. And I was getting sick again, kind of, with a deep cough, beginning pneumonia. And I knew I had to go to the doctor. And at this point, my husband had changed jobs 3 times in that year because he had been a regional manager. And so in order to support the family, he was just taking the best job he could get because obviously we needed an income. And so it took 3 job hops to get to the salary and to get to the company and the type of job he was looking for. And now we were going to get insurance July 1st and it's May. So I got about 6 weeks to go. So I go to this doctor and the bruise is so bad. And I said, well, obviously I understand something is wrong with my blood because you don't get bruises like this unless something is wrong. And I'm getting pneumonia and it's May and we live in California. You don't typically get pneumonia in May unless there is something else underlying condition. So he sees that bruise and he first thinks that my husband is abusing me. So he literally rips the t-shirts off my children to look at on their bodies to see if there's any bruises. And I kept telling him, I'm telling you the truth. This is what happened. And I understand what's going on. My father was a doctor. My mom worked. She was a hospital floor administrator. I was around doctors my whole childhood. I understand this is a blood issue, but I'm getting insurance in 6 weeks. So I'm not going to go to the ER and I'm not going to do a lab test because I'm going to have a pre-existing condition and I'm never going to get insurance. And I survived this long. I said, I'm so much better now. You should have seen me 6 months ago. I got myself here. I drove myself here and I brought my children with me, something I wouldn't even have been able to do 6 months ago. So again, gave me a lot of medication. So this was my existence. And so now later, years later, when I fessed up to the doctor and told him what had happened, he said, you probably had idiopathic aplastic anemia, which is a bone marrow suppression. So it suppresses the platelets and the white blood cells and the red blood cells. So you're basically are low on all the blood cells, which makes sense because I didn't have an immune system. So I was getting sick all the time. I was exhausted. So I didn't have enough red blood cells to carry the oxygen. And I was bruising all the time. And so you have a low platelet count. And this was just my existence for the next couple of years. And if I put my knee on the floor, I would get a bruise just from resting my knee on the floor to tie my children's shoes. So I became a very good squatter. I would squat. I still squat. It's a habit now. But it took a good 6 years for me to come out of that. And for the first couple of years, I couldn't even stand up to cook for my children. So I had a stool in the kitchen and I would sit on the stool. And I remember my 90-year-old something grandma had this tall stool next to her stove. So that's what I did. I got this tall stool so I could sit and flip pancakes for the kids and things like that. Because I couldn't stand up that long because I would get dizzy and I would faint. And there was always this feeling of my soul not having merged back in with the body. So it always felt like my soul was trying to leave. It was always like several times a day, I would say, nope, nope, we're not leaving. We're staying here. And this feeling of, no, 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 come back, soul, come back into the body. And there was a separation of the soul and the body. Right now, I'm just one with my body. So, but that took a good 6 years before that soul was merged back in. So that was my existence. And I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would feel dizzy and my head would be pounding because that just wasn't enough blood. And I would take my head off the pillow, put my legs up and do things like that to try and get the circulation going. So my second NDE happened in the middle of the night during this period of healing. And for a long time, I struggled with the evidence. So here I am having another experience where I'm leaving my body, which is very different from my first experience. And I will share it in a moment. But that feeling of how do I prove it? Now, the first near-death experience happened in the emergency room. So I could prove that I was on the brink of death, right? And they saved my life. But the second one happens in the middle of the night. Where is that? How can I prove it? But then after many, many years, so this was in 1994, and it wasn't until around 2013 that I came to terms with it and learned about spiritually transformative experiences, which you don't have to be near death. And actually, a near death experience, many people think that you have to be dead or you're clinically dead. But the most near death experiences happens close to death. You're close to death. So, and spiritually transformative experiences can happen anytime, right? And they can be very similar to a near-death experience. But I finally came to terms with it because it's not about the experience itself and what we call it, but it is what happens to that person as a result of having that experience. And so now I'm going to share my second near-death experience, which is very different from my first one. And I always joke that I didn't get the full effect of the first one. And that's why this second one had to happen, because it's the second one that really activated my life path and is driving my work still today. So in the middle of the night, I wake up, I get the pounding headache, I take my head off the pillow, and I get sucked out of my body just like I did the first time. But this time I'm traveling through darkness. So imagine Star Wars, you're flying through universe, tumbling through darkness in space. And then I get to this place that I call the mid station, only because there was an awareness of you could go higher. And there was awareness that there were floors below me, so to speak. So if you go into a skyscraper and there are 100 floors and you get off at the 50th floor, then you know that there are floors above you, you know there are floors below you. So it's that kind of a sensation. And I call it the bouncing station only because they sent me back and I did not have a choice. So some people that have these experiences are given a choice. Do you want to stay? Do you want to go back? There was no choice. That's why I call it the bouncing station, because you get there and they're like, oh, no, you can't go any higher. We're going to send you back. So I get to this place and I hear the most beautiful music you can't even make in this dimension. And I'm wondering where this music is coming from. And I look to the right and I see this little log cabin. And I just think it's funny what we see. I see a log cabin, and it might be because that would make me comfortable because I was born and raised in Sweden with little log cabins. Kind of looked like a sauna, almost like a little Swedish sauna log cabin. So I open the door, I look inside, but it's empty. So then I look to the left and there's a mirror image of the same log cabin on my left. And again, I open the door, I look inside, but it's empty. But then I become aware of this growing white light that comes from behind me and starts to envelope me. And as I turn around into this light, which I can only describe as fog with a spotlight in it, because it extends into infinity. So when you look into fog, all you see is white. And it was that kind of a feeling. You're just enveloped, you're in the light. And the music is coming from the light, but in the light, there is an outline of angels. And the music is coming from the angels. But I don't believe in angels. So, what am I experiencing? But the light itself is God or source. I don't care what name you give it, but it is what we come from. We are part of that light. It is like the creation, and we are creation. We are part of that. There is no separation of God or source or us. We are part of that. As I'm saying, we tend to think of heaven or God is out there and we're down here, but we are part of that. And that light source is, we carry that light within us. That is unconditional love. And when we die, we return to that light. And so it is who we are. We are love and light, and we carry that within us. And I would say the world and life is built around love and light. The more we give, the more love we generate ourselves, the more love we get in return. And the world is really built on love. But sometimes it's hard when we go through life to remember that, because we have emotions and struggles to deal with. But then I become aware of two spirit guides, and the spirit guide on the right communicates with the other spirit guide to the left and diagonally in front of me. And he says, "What is she doing here? She can't be here. She has to go back." And I say, no, wait a second. How can I be outside my body and still be me? Because this has been on my mind now for 2 years already. And the spirit guide on my left says, "Well, if I told you, you wouldn't remember." So there's some kind of control mechanism, what we get to remember when we have these experiences. But then he said, "You will remember this." But then it is as if I'm standing on the moon and I'm looking down on the earth, but around the earth, there is what I call a silvery, glittery fishnet. And I grew up in Sweden, and the archipelago has about 25,000 islands. And in the summers, I spent time on this island about 3 months every year with no electricity, no running water. And my grandmother would lay fish nets in the ocean to catch fish for the family to eat. And I finally graduated to be the little rower of the boat, which was an honor because I had 3 older brothers, and I waited for that moment when I would get to row the boat. And so I would row this little boat for my grandmother. And when she lifted those nets up and out of the ocean in the early morning sun, when the sun hit the fish net, those water droplets on the fish net would sparkle in the sunlight. So this is 1994. There was no internet or Google to Google these things. So to me, it looked like a fishnet around the earth. And the spirit guide said, everything on earth is connected to each other. And everything on earth is connected up to this grid. And with that information, I got sent back to earth. And I would say that is what is still driving everything that I do today and my work today, because we are truly connected. More than we think. We're connected through the DNA. We're connected through this grid, or the invisible grid, as I call it. And I work a lot with ancestral healing now, and you can see the connection that we have to our ancestors and how certain patterns repeat within the families, whether you have met that person or not. And so it's fascinating how that experience in 1994 is still driving my work today. And I spent years trying to figure out, why is there no time on the other side? I combed the San Francisco Public Library because we lived in the suburb of San Francisco for 12 years. And I went through the entire library. I had stacks of books next to my bed. And this was in 2003 to 2004. And I was trying to find any information that could talk about this grid that I had seen. And after a year of reading about a book a week, I gave up. I said, that's it. I can't find it. Maybe there is information, but I'm not looking in the right area of the library. It wasn't like I could ask the public librarian for help either. Do you know about that grid around the earth? So I just read a lot of books. I read physics books. I read Stephen Hawking's books. Why is there no time on the other side? And then in 2004, I said, that's it. I'm healed. I give up. And I just put it all to rest. And I figured someday that grid will make sense. But during these 12 years, there was this opening of awareness to the spirit world. And I would start to hear things from the spirit world. I would know people who had passed away. So I can share some of these stories. So between my first and second near-death experience, so I was 1 year out, and my uncle passed away in Sweden, and we were here in the United States. And in the middle of the night, I woke up and I knew my uncle was in the ceiling at the end of the bed. And he was looking down. I couldn't see him, but I knew it was him, and he was communicating with me telepathically. And he said he had passed on to the other side. He just came to say goodbye. He just wanted to let me know. And I mean, when I look back at some of these events, I think it's just a way for the spirit world to train me. It was my training wheels to understand that opening. And I had to have all these different types of experiences to understand I have an ability to connect with the spirit world, and I can hear them. And sometimes now I see them. So I knew it was my uncle, and I figured my mom would call me the next morning and tell me, because it was her brother. Nobody called me. So I said, wow, that's so strange. Nobody's calling me. And another day went by. Nobody called me. Finally, on the third day, my mom calls, and she says, hey, I'm just checking in. How is everything going? Blah, blah, blah. And then she said, I have something sad to share with you. And I said, I know, your brother passed away 3 days ago. And it was just dead silence. And she knows, how did you know? And I said, he was here. So at that point, I started getting confirmation. And then as these 12 years went by, I would get more and more confirmations. I knew my father was passing away. I knew that relatives were sick and had to go to the hospital. I saw an accident. An accident was going to happen with two of the kids in my car. And I woke up that morning and I said, you two are in the car. And I was driving them to San Francisco at the time, because they were students at the San Francisco Ballet School. And we lived in East Bay. So every day I would have to drive them in because they were too young to take the subway system. And I said, we had a van, and I said, there's a big scratch on the van door and on the passenger side. You two are in the car, and I'm leaving a note on a black sedan car on the windshield. But I don't understand, where are the people that drove that car? Why am I not seeing other people? If it's a bad accident and they were hurt, I would have seen ambulances or police or something. But I just saw the scratch, the two kids in the car, my son in the front seat, my daughter in the back seat, and then I'm leaving a note on the windshield. So we figured out there's only one intersection. When we get off the Bay Bridge, we get down to the surface streets, we're going to turn left, that there's oncoming traffic, that we could possibly get hit on the right-hand side of the car. About 2 weeks go by. Every day we get to this intersection, my kids' noses are pressed up against the window. Mom, the coast is clear, nobody's coming. And then, we were fine. And then we were in the bookstore in Walnut Creek in East Bay, San Francisco, where we lived in that area at the time. And we're coming out of the bookstore, and there's a big truck offloading books. And I'm trying to get onto this very narrow little street. Our car's trying to get into this parking lot. And as I exit the parking lot, and I'm making a right-hand turn onto this narrow street, there's a black sedan car parked, the last car in that row on the street. And as I make a right turn onto the street, the right-hand side of my car scrapes the left rear fender of this black sedan car. So at this point, I know exactly what happened, right? So I know what that scratch is going to look like. So I get out of my car, walk around the car, and just throw my hands up to the heavens and just start laughing. And people were just staring at me because they must have thought I was the kookiest lady they had ever seen. Here's this woman laughing hysterically at her accident, right? The black scratch on my car. But I was just so relieved that it was finally over, because it had been 2 weeks of worrying about, what's going to happen. So of course, nobody was driving the car, and I'm leaving this note on the windshield of the black sedan car. So this was, and it's such a good, some of these stories are so good because there is evidence, and, I'm sharing it with other people. But I would often write down things. I had a little log. I would write things down when I saw things or I got messages, so that, a couple of days later, when this became true, I could go back and look in my notebook and say, yeah, I'm not having a deja vu. I wrote it down 3 days ago. And it could be just images that I would get. I could hear things, or I sometimes, I could have a dream about something and I would write it down. So the messages came in all different ways. And after 12 years of, writing everything down and having all these different experiences, I finally learned to trust in the spirit world. But it took me 12 years to really trust that, because I was so scientific. I had such a hard time trusting that it was something that was really happening, and the spirit world really is there, and we don't die. It's just our physical body that dies, but our soul survives, and we're always there. We're always present. And it was after 12 years that I received the messages in my living room, because I had decided I should go back to work. The kids are teenagers, and I always wanted to work in the healing profession, but just never did it because I moved to the United States, and the English barrier was so great in the beginning. So I was at my computer and I saw this degree and it said naturopathic doctor. And then I realized it was a real medical school. And I was like, oh my God, I can't do that. I can't go to med school. I'm already in my 40s. I got to do all the prereqs, all the chemistry and all that. So I closed my computer and I said, that's it. I can't, that's not possible. The mind says, the logical mind says, don't do it. And even if I did all the prereqs, there was no guarantee I was ever going to be admitted at my age into medical school. So I closed my computer and walked towards the kitchen. And as I did so, I became aware of a spirit guide. And he said, no, you have to go to medical school and become a doctor. And you're to combine East and West, which I understood that is kind of what naturopathic medicine is, because we learn acupuncture, homeopathy, botanical medicine, and pharmaceutical medicine. So we have a bigger toolbox in a sense. We have more options to treat people. So we get a lot of people that may have sensitivities to pharmaceuticals or are not getting better with that option. So I got the message I had to be a doctor. I had to combine East and West. I was to bring messages and healing to the people. And I'm like, what messages? What are you talking about? And then they said, you have to write 2 books. No, wait, 3. And I said, what book? What book am I what am I supposed to write about? English is not even my native language. What are you talking about? And they said, for now, just focus on med school. That's step 1. So within a week, I was enrolled in prereq classes at the community college. And I had to start from the beginning because I didn't have any science classes. I was a business and computer science major out of college. I was a programmer and systems analyst working for IBM after I graduated from Boston University. And so I had to start with advanced placement biology from like a high school class at the community college just to get into the prereq classes. And then I had to take, biology 1, biology 2, and then chem 1, chem 2, chem 1, or chem 2, physics, math, all those classes. So did all that, and then went, applied to medical school. I applied to 2 schools. There's only 5 schools for naturopathic medicine or medical schools, and applied to 2 of them. One was here in Arizona, and the other one was up in the Seattle area. And I was accepted to both schools. And I picked, every time I tried to go to the one in Seattle, because I said, well, I will always lived on water, right? In Sweden, always water. Stockholm is on water. And then lived in Boston, lived in New York, lived in Los Angeles, lived in San Francisco. So I'm always by a big body of water. And I was drawn to the Seattle school because it was on the coast. And every time I decided that I was going to go to Seattle, I would be awake. The spirit world would wake me up every night. And then I would give up and I said, okay, fine. I'll go to the one in Arizona, even though it's in the desert. And then they would let me sleep. And then I would start hesitating again and say, no, I don't know if I can do the desert. I'm going to go to the one in Seattle. And then again, I'll be awake every night. And until finally I said, all right, fine. I am going to go to the one in Arizona. So that's how I ended up at medical school. And I was accepted into medical school at the age of 54 and graduated, did that program in 4 years. You can do it in 4 years or 5 years, and graduated when I was 58. And then as soon as I graduated, you graduate in June, and then you take the boards, the medical boards in August, which is 3 days of testing. So basically you just study for a month to review what you did for the past 2 years. So you can imagine the amount of material. You basically see the material once and you go on, you have to remember it. Then took my boards, and then that was in the beginning of August, and then it takes almost 2 months for them to correct it, because these board exams are given across the country at the exact same time, and then they get corrected. So if there is, let's say, somebody in Massachusetts, they throw out a question because they realized that was really two correct answers. Somehow there was a way, then those questions get thrown out, but then they get thrown out across the country. So, it has to be like equal grading across the whole nation. And so I didn't even know if I had passed my boards. And I meet this woman who says at a training, because I went to training craniosacral therapy because I was just working and helping out in a clinic because I didn't have my license yet. And we met at this craniosacral therapy, and we never got to work with each other, but we were somehow drawn to each other. And I said, wow, you live here in Phoenix too, but the training was actually in California. So I said, well, let's meet for dinner. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be in your area. So we meet for dinner. I don't know anything about this woman. And she says, I'm a medium and I have your mother here. And are you open to receive messages? And at this point, even though I had gone, I could receive messages. I went to medical school based on a message, but I still wasn't sure you could bring in messages for other people. So I'm looking at her thinking, she doesn't know anything about me. I'm from Sweden. I had a very different upbringing than, an American. There is no way she's going to get this information right. That was my thought. So I said, sure, I'm open. And sure enough, she brought in my mom, and she said, you have to go to Arthur Findlay College and study mediumship. And I said, I can't do that. I just graduated. I don't even know if I passed my boards yet. And she says 3 times they kept with just one evidence after another. And finally I said, okay, I'll figure out a way to go to England and study mediumship. And then 6 months later, I was at Arthur Findlay College in England studying mediumship. And it still took me a good 3 days. So I was there for a whole week. And first we learned to read people psychically. And then on the 3rd day, she said, okay, you guys are ready to start communicating with the spirit world. And I'm thinking, how is this going to go? Because how am I supposed to bring in a message for this woman sitting across from me? She looks like she doesn't even have a grandmother in the spirit world. She looks so young to me. So, but that first reading, it's still so vivid in my mind because I was just so surprised of the accuracy. And after I did that reading, I thought it was just luck. It was just pure luck. And then I went on and did another reading. And again, it was all accurate. And I said, it was just pure luck. And this went on for a good day or two. And then I realized, okay, it's not luck because, you can't do correct readings like this. But just to share that first reading that I did, I saw this older woman, and it's so vivid in my mind still. And she was, a little bit hunched back. She was older. And I said, she's in an elderly home, but it's a very small elderly home. And there's only about 10 tables, and she's in this cafeteria. But she's showing me a cup of coffee. She's holding up a white cup of coffee. She's showing me that. And she also had a cane, and she like a long coat. And I said, do you understand this? And she said, yes. I said, okay, because we're only allowed to say yes and no. That's it, not to lead on in any way. And I said, okay, now she's showing me where she lived, but she's showing me she lived on a farm. There's a big country kitchen, but when you open the door, I see chickens and pigs running loose outside. But then I see, a fence, and there's like horses out on a field. And I said, do you understand this? And she said, yes. I said, okay. And then I said, she's again showing me a cup of coffee. And I said, do you understand this? Yes. And then I saw this image of this cake, and to me it looked like something out of a Disney movie. So I kept thinking, it can't be correct. It can't be correct. But we were told you have to say whatever comes, because otherwise first of all, you'll never learn if it's your brain making it up or if it's coming from somewhere else. And it's just what you have to do. And that's how you learn, okay, when the message comes this way, that's from the spirit world. When it came that way, that was my brain. And you learn to sort it out. So I kept seeing this cake, and it was a 3-tier cake with whipped cream dotted with cherries. So I said, this looks like something out of a Disney movie. So finally, after the third image of this cake, I said, she's showing me this cake, and this is what it looks like. And I said, do you understand this? And she said, yes. So it turns out that it was her grandmother, and she grew up next to her grandmother's house in the countryside. And every day in the afternoon, she would go to her grandma's house for a cup of coffee. And that was what they did every single day. So that was why I kept seeing a cup of coffee, because that's what they got together for every day. And then the cake was the cake that her grandma made for her every birthday. It was a 3-tiered cake. So, but when you go through this, when you see things, when you're working as a medium and you see things, sometimes in the beginning, especially, you hesitate thinking, could this really be related to them? But you have, then you learn, you always say what the message is, because it always makes sense for that person. So, and that's how the beginning to my whole journey of becoming a medium began.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Lotte. I have so many questions. Where do I begin? So first, I wanted to ask, after your first NDE, up until your second one, you still weren't convinced at that point that there was God or spirit world. I hear you say that you need a lot of evidence, right? But what was going on in those 2 years?
Yeah, I kept thinking, is it true? Is it true? Could it be? And I had a hard time, sharing. I only shared the story with my husband, my mother-in-law, and my best friend. And it was my mother-in-law, when I shared the story with her, she said, what happened during that birth? Because she could probably tell I was in deep thought, trying to figure out, could it be real? Was I really outside my body? Is this some kind of hallucination that happened? I was trying to make sense of it, because my belief system, it didn't fit into my belief system at all, right? Because I thought you die, there is nothing else. And so she went and got me the book Life After Life with Raymond Moody, that Raymond Moody wrote. Mm-hmm. And so then I understood that I had some kind of an experience. And my best friend also said, you had some kind of spiritual experience. I don't know what it is, but that's what happened. And I was just trying to, make sense out of it. What was that? But then when I had my second experience, I would say that's when I started to really understand, okay, it happened again. I understand this is just something that I'm here to experience. And I also had a lot of electrical interference. So all my watches stopped, and my first watch stopped right away after birth. And I didn't have a watch for like 9 months, because I wasn't well enough to even go to a store. So finally, after like 9 months, I was just strong enough to bring the kids, walk right inside a Target. For those who are familiar with Target, it's like a Caldor if you live on the East Coast. And the watch department is typically right inside when you enter. So it was easy to get in. I picked out a watch, paid for it, and left. And then the watch stopped within a week. It was like 5 days, and it stopped. And I said, wow, I can't believe it stopped. I'm going to have to bring it back. And it was such an ordeal, because I was so exhausted, because this is when the bone marrow suppression was kicking in. And I made it back to the store, and I showed them the watch, and they said, wow, that's so strange. We haven't gotten any other watches. And they said, well, just go pick out a new one. I picked out a new one, and again, worked for about 5 or 7 days, and it stopped. So I bring it back again. I'm so embarrassed. I went to a different Target. I didn't want to face those women one more time, and returned it. And I said, oh, I don't know what happened. It just stopped. I just got it. Here's my receipt. So I said, I'll pick a different one this time. And I picked a different brand. And again, within a week, it stopped. So then I told my friend, and she said, it's not the watch, it's you, honey. So at that point, I realized, it was me. And there were lots of other things. VCRs would not turn on. So I would have to instruct my 6-year-old from like looking into the room where we had the VCR and say, no, not that button, the one with the triangle, that's the button, push that. Because if I did it, it wouldn't work. And so he would learn how to turn things on so they could watch, a movie. It was back when we had the VHS tapes, the big tapes. We would get a Blockbuster. And And I had the television turned on. I walked by the television. And this is around my daughter's first birthday. And the television turned on. And I said, that's really weird. And I looked, and I'm thinking maybe it's my kids, because they were 7, 4.5, and 1. So I'm thinking maybe it's the 7-year-old or the 5-year-old, almost 5-year-old that got the clicker. But the clicker was on the table. And the kids were playing right outside with some friends. So I said, okay, there must be somebody else watching TV that have the same TV I do. They put the TV on, but they weren't thinking. They aimed it at the window. It came through my window, turned my television on. I'm just trying to think of how could this happen. So I went to all my neighbors and I rang the doorbell and I said, are you watching TV? No, nobody was watching TV, or they were not home because they were at work. And then I go back in and I walk by the television, it turns back on. So then at this point, I realized that I'm doing it. So I would say there is some, this is logged at IAN, so International Association for Near-Death Studies, have lists of the psychological and physiological after effects of many people that experience a near-death experience. Mm-hmm. And I would say there's something that doesn't, click, because also my soul wasn't merged back in, right? So I have the separation of my soul and my body, but there's something that happens. And I know there are people, when they get mad, the light bulb explodes and all sorts of crazy things happen. But now it doesn't happen. But it happened for, many, many years. I would have these issues. And after 12 years, my watch finally ticked for an entire year. So for every year out, so after 1 year, my watch would tick for about a month. After 2 years, it would tick for 2 months. After 3 years, it would tick for 3 months. So I know when my daughter was about 3, I had like 16 or 17 watches in my drawer. And sometimes they would start ticking again. And I would only get a watch that had a second hand on it, because it was the only way I would know it was actually working. So when the kids asked me, what time is it? I would have to wait, look at my watch, make sure the second hand was moving, and then say what time it was. And then sometimes some of the watches would start working, so I could wear them for another week. So I would just look and see if there was one working. So that was just my existence for many years. And all these different things happening and electrical interference.
Interesting. So you've had a lot of visions. I'm sure you still get them, whether it's a vision of what's to come or someone passing away. What are your thoughts on fate and free will and our ability to perhaps shift timelines or create our own reality? What are your thoughts on those two things?
I think we incarnate with certain experiences, that we're to have certain experiences, because there are times when things just seem too planned. And when you see things before they happen, it doesn't matter how hard I try to shift that from not happening. It's not going to change, because I think that, our life, we come in and we have a timestamp on our head, this is my expiration date, this date, this time. Or maybe we have several expiration dates, depending on if we got everything done or not. But then other people talk about, this was one of my outs that have had near-death experiences. And I've heard them talk about saying I had a choice. I could stay or I could go back at this point. And so they're giving different outs. Now, I didn't have a choice. So maybe my path or my incarnation is just different. But I think we incarnate to have certain experiences, and we come with certain means to have that experience. Because when you look at your chart astrologically, when you look at your numerology, you can see that there are certain paths and certain things we incarnated for. So when you look at my numerology, for example, for those that know Felicia Bender, the numerologist, I've interviewed her a couple of times, and it's fascinating. So my life path is as a healer, and I have a master life path as an 11. So that means I incarnated as a healer, and everything about that number is my incarnation. I'm here to help other people heal. It doesn't matter if people do an astrological reading, they do a mediumship reading, they do a numerology reading, it's always the same. You're here as a healer. You're here to help people break patterns. You are here to create healing physically, emotionally, spiritually. And it's always the same. And that's my incarnation. And everybody has a purpose in their life. They incarnated to do something. And sometimes it doesn't make sense because we just, going through life is like riding a roller coaster. And there's so many hurdles to overcome. And everybody has hurdles, because without the hurdles, we don't grow, right? So we have to have hurdles to overcome. And that's how our consciousness evolves and grows. If we sat on the beach in Hawaii and sipped pina coladas for our entire life, how much would we grow? How much would our soul grow? How much would our consciousness grow? It wouldn't grow, right? Because we're just sitting there. But it is through our life experiences and through the different hurdles that we're overcoming that our soul grows. So I would say, yes, I think there are certain things that we incarnated to have certain experiences. Do we have free will? Yeah, I get to decide what I'm going to eat for dinner today. I get to decide which path I'm going to take next, what I'm going to study next, what I'm going to do. I have free will, but underlying that, I think there is also an incarnation that we're trying to fulfill. So I think we like to make it easy, but it's not that straightforward. Right. Life is a mystery and always will be a mystery, because if we knew exactly everything, then there would be no point in even being here.
Absolutely. So I find it interesting that you had all of these experiences with medical professionals, with your health, and then you eventually became a medical professional yourself. Did those experiences, maybe how you were treated, or how things were conducted in the hospital or anything like that, did that influence how you approach your clients and how you intend to see them as maybe not just a chart, a diagnosis, but more than that? Did those experiences influence the way you approach your work?
I would say absolutely, because the way we experience life is based on our own frame of reference. So those rose-colored glasses that we made for ourselves, going through our own life and having our own experiences, then that's going to shape how we're going to interact with other humans and animals and the planet itself. So absolutely, that makes a difference. When I work with people, whether I work with them spiritually in a medical intuitive setting or working with patients, I have that empathy for them, what they're going through. Feeling stuck, feeling like they can never heal. Is this forever? I've been there. I lived there for many years. I thought, I'm 10 years out. Maybe this is just my new normal. Maybe I will just never be normal again. And then all of a sudden at 12 years, everything just shifted and I took off with going back to school. So I think all of our experiences shape how we interact. And I would say, yes, definitely, they have shaped how I interact.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So I love that you have both of these sides, right? The scientific mind, the spiritual mind. A lot of people say that there isn't room for both, or that they contradict each other. And I'm sure that you've got your own opinion on that. So what would you say as far as how
it's at a deeper level, I think, than most of us realize, because people who heal, typically people don't heal from just a Western medicine approach. There is always work that has to be done, underlying work of emotional and a spiritual component to create healing, but it's not one or the other, right? So I get a lot of people that say, I'm really spiritual. I know I can, if I just meditate more, this cancer is going to go away. And I tell them, don't trust that just because you're going to meditate or pray that you're going to get well. It might have happened to a few people, but that might also have been their incarnation to heal through that mode. We don't know what ticket you took in the spirit world before you incarnated. Maybe you're supposed to heal with Western medicine, or a combination of, let's say they have cancer, chemotherapy, but also using botanical medicine, acupuncture, meditation, and all the other different avenues of holistic medicine. But we don't know what ticket we're holding on to. And now we have something physically manifested in our physical body. We typically need to use physical means to heal the physical, right? If it's just sitting in your spiritual or emotional body, that's different. Then maybe you can just open up those avenues and meditate and do all these other things. But now if we have something that's in our physical system, then let's use all the tools that we have available to us and merge all of those different approaches together, and that will most likely create the best outcome.
Love it. So I just have a couple more questions. This grid, I'm really interested to know, what is your understanding of this now after all of these years?
Everything is connected to this grid. We are all connected to each other. Everything that you do and say, all your reactions, all your interactions, is going to affect everybody around you, whether you've seen them or not. And I work with ancestral healing, and I see this a lot. It doesn't matter if you never met grandpa, because you're still going to be entangled in that web. And I would say that is that grid, that is that net, that we are all part of that greater net, because in the end, we're all one. We are all in the same body, so to speak. So if you look at it, you have a body, and in your body, you have all these organs and you have all these different blood cells, but you're part of the Earth's body. So think of it. So you're just a cell to the Earth's body. Well, all the other people that are here, they're also just cells. They're also part of the same body. So I'm saying, so we're all connected, and so in the end, we're all one, because that interconnectivity is how we become all one when and then we're all connected up to this grid. So we're all part of the same system. And, when we look at disagreement between the different people and racism, it's look at your body. You have viruses, you have bacteria, you got a couple of cells fighting against the other cells. No, I'm going to win. I'm the virus. I'm going to win this fight. But when you look at the whole world, you can look at all populations, that's one virus. These people over here is another virus. They're all fighting to get control, but it's the same system in the end that we have inside of us. And so we're all part of the greater, the greater net, or the greater existence, which is all one in the end.
I love that analogy of the cells in the body. And truly, I believe when, we heal, we're also healing our, loved ones and people we're connected to, and essentially everyone else on the earth. And so one last question. Certainly we don't need to have an NDE to have, a wake-up call, or to step on our path, or to understand our purpose more. So how would you recommend people who may be listening to this can really connect with the spirit world, to hear messages, to connect with their path? What would you recommend they do?
There's really only one way to start connecting, and that's to meditate. So if you ask any person who works as a medium, and I've asked all my teachers that I've interviewed on my own podcast, what do you recommend? And it's always the same answer. It's always meditation. And it's sitting in stillness and quieting the mind, and just create the awareness of consciousness itself. And we are humans, so we're going to have thoughts that come and go, because the brain is always busy giving us grocery lists and laundry lists of things that we need to do. But it's just, acknowledging the thought, let it go back into that stillness. Another thought comes, acknowledge the thought, let it go. And it's just keep practicing the stillness until, you can sit in being quiet and meditate, for about an hour a day. So I meditated probably an hour a day for 2 to 3 years before I had the ability to start bringing in messages for, other people, and get a clearer hearing, vision. But it comes, when you do that, when you sit in that stillness, you're going to start connecting. And we all have that. We all have the ability. We're all spiritual creatures. It's just, we didn't get that training. We're just busy surviving on the earth plane, doing all these different things. We got to go to school, then we got to go to college, then we got to get a degree, and then we got to get a job. And it's just one thing after another. And so that's not part, especially not of the Western culture. If we started teaching all the kids and they meditated an hour a day in school, I think we would see a big difference in just who we are as human beings on the planet.
I have to agree with that. Do you have any last messages, anything else you'd like to share?
Yes. Like I end my book with this, and it is that we are all connected and we're all one, and it is all divine, and so are you. And not to forget that, because it is much more divine than we realize.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lotte. I really enjoyed this conversation. I will link all of your information below. I know that you teach, you do courses, right? You offer services. So I'll link all of your information below, as well as your book. And I just really appreciate this time together. Thank you for spreading the message and for sharing your light with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.